The name of this video is The Legacy of Theft Part 2. Now, we're all familiar with seeing a vehicle with a license plate on the back. Some states like New York, New Jersey, their vehicles have two plates. And these plates are a big money-making apparatus for the state to collect millions of dollars every year. Let's see how this evolved. Well, starting in 1901, the vehicle left the factory as a marked vessel, and there was a brass nameplate bolted on the outside, and that plate contained certain elements such as the name of the manufacturer, location of the factory, and the serial and model number of the vehicle. Then, when you purchased a new vehicle, you were issued a certificate of ownership, and that was like a two-ply document, meaning that the dealer transferred liability to you, and therefore that certificate of ownership was also your operator's license. That's all you needed. You're good to go. Now, names and phrases, or words and phrases I should say, are oftentimes sensitive. Before this vehicle was sold, like this brass nameplate was an identification plate, and then after it was sold, it became the registration plate, meaning that because this vehicle was now linked to you, relevant to the liability. Back then, prior to 1903, registration was done in-house at the local dealer. Their records had to be available to local authorities, and so on. Now, well, this horseless carriage posed a problem for politicians. Back then, the roads were not adequate to meet the new demand. So where was the money going to come from? Back in 1901, most of the county roads were dirt. Each county was responsible financially for its own roads. If a state road went through a county, well, the state took care of that road, and there was no such thing as federal funding. That didn't come about until like 1916. Well, the politicians did not want to raise general taxes to meet this new demand. So where was the money going to come from for road upgrades? They figured out a backdoor approach. Figured out a way to confiscate these vehicles as property, and then use the equity as collateral to acquire bonds for road upgrades. It was all about theft, but they had to confiscate these vehicles from the owners without the owners being the wiser. So the hand of poker, the bluff, was started all in Pennsylvania, was Act 202 of 1903. It was a hand of poker, a bluff, because that law had no standing. It did not have supportive legislation. The governor did not sign a declared emergency. So starting in 1903, you had like 10 days to go up to the county courthouse and have the vehicle registered. Now, they were claiming that registration was mandatory, but yet they're telling you to fill out an application. So now you fill out that application, you're doing this registration voluntarily, not mandatory. That application for registration, that was a slick move, because you were making a declaration that the vehicle was dangerous, and also you would make a declaration that the vehicle was an unmarked vessel, therefore technically a contraband. And this Act 202 of 1903, it kind of like unofficially pre-adjudicated all vehicles as dangerous and all motorists as reckless by default. And now pre-adjudication is like illegal, because that would be like saying that all Mexicans are drug smugglers, or all Italians are wife beaters, or all Irish are drunks. You can't make that, you can't just throw everyone into a classification. They tried that during World War II when they claimed that all Japanese Americans were deemed enemy of the states, and then they were all rounded up and placed in detention camps. So But anyway, see, now that the brass nameplate was removed, that gave the Commonwealth a self-made excuse to intervene and replace it with one made out of cardboard. That was only for the first 2 years. Now that cardboard placard it was like two functions. One, it was a certificate of registration, and that it would list your name and address and the description of the vehicle. And it was also the registration plate because it had the registration number. Well, see, when you filled out that application form, you would be making a declaration the vehicle was dangerous, and also it was an unmarked vessel, and you were forfeiting all claim to contraband. And then in this way here, when you went up to the county courthouse, you had to bring along your certificate of ownership. The proprietary took temporary custody, and the proprietary placed a gold seal on that document. Thereby, your certificate of ownership became county property, and also the vehicle became county property. And now the scam was neat that for the first 2 years, they allowed the people to still retain possession of their certificate of ownership. But no one knew that that document now was county property, and the vehicle as well. See, that act, that 202 of 1903, the governor had no need to sign a declared emergency because they figured out a way through that application form to have each motorist sign a declared emergency, one application at a time. That was a slick move. So now, when the county claimed ownership of this document, it also claimed ownership of the liability. Well, it didn't want that. They wanted to give that back to you. Okay. For the first 2 years, registration was a one-time event. You paid your $2 or about $40 at today's prices, and you had to display this cardboard placard at all times, and you didn't have to have it renewed every year. So the county had to give you back the liability, and it did that with the operator's license. This was another slick move. Well, for the first 2 years, 1903 and 1904, this license plate would have been your actual operator's license. It came with like a handheld certificate to verify that this plate was assigned to you, not the vehicle. And these plates were covered in porcelain enamel. But then the switch came in 1905 when the license plate now became the vehicle license. And people, see, the first 2 years they were issuing these licenses to get people accustomed to seeing a license plate on the back of the vehicle. And then they went, and all of a sudden now the function of that plate changed from the operator's license to a vehicle license. So people fail to realize that for the first 2 years, 1903, 1904, all vehicles were county property. But then in 1905, all vehicles became state property. Okay. So to recap so far, for 1903 and 1904, the brass nameplate was now concealed somewhere. You had a cardboard placard that was your certificate of registration and registration plate that had to be, like I said, permanently displayed. Now this thing right here, that is actually a dashboard. So that cardboard placard was usually displayed like somewhere inside here, because if this was parked, the vehicle was parked on the street, a police officer could just walk up and look inside, and he could see this placard. It had to be publicly displayed at all times. But for the first 2 years, your operator's license, at the end of the day, you were able to take your operator's license and bring it in the house with you for safekeeping. Same way with a hunting license. When you were done hunting, you were able to take the license off your jacket and like put it in a drawer. But 1905, that was when the big switch came. The years 1903, 1904, that was the beta test years, as I call it, just to get people accustomed to this new registration procedure. So starting in 1905, a vehicle only needed one plate now. It's called a vehicle license plate. The certificate of certificate of registration was split in that the certificate of registration now became a handheld document, and the registration plate became the operator's replaced this operator's license plate. So now 1905, the vehicle only needed one plate. So how did vehicles become state property? As I mentioned, first 2 years, the people were allowed to retain ownership or possession of that certificate of ownership. So then starting in 1905, vehicle registration was centralized in Harrisburg. So now the people would have to, were told they had to forward their paperwork that was given to them by the dealer to Harrisburg for processing. But no one told them to attach a self-addressed stamped envelope along with instructions that after this process was completed, they wanted their documents back. And because the people didn't ask for their documents back, they were left in Harrisburg, and after 45 days they were deemed abandoned property under maritime salvage. The Commonwealth claimed ownership of the documents, but also the vehicle as well. Now a new document was created called the Certificate of Title, and so that was you surrendered your certificate of ownership, and it was replaced now with a certificate of title. And people think that that certificate of title proves that they own the vehicle as private property. It's all an illusion. I'm going to have a separate video looking at these titles and to explain all the defects. So now, I mean, prior to 1903, you bought a vehicle, you were the owner. And then, starting in 1903, you became a registered owner. Because, or a more appropriate term would be the tenant. Since from 1905 to 1918, all vehicles were state property, so you needed a occupancy permit to occupy state property, and that came about through the certificate of title. And then you needed a license to use state property, which people call today is the registration plate. What else here? I can't stress enough that was a slick move here. The first 2 years, this license was your operator's license, and then bingo, in 1905 it became the vehicle license. Well, see, concerning license, now when you got your that license plate starting in 1905, you had a handheld called the license certificate, but also that was the liability. So you were the named liable party. The state was only after the equity. It didn't want the liability, so they had to figure out a way to have you assume responsibility. So now the state was collecting all this equity because they were in possession of the certificate of ownership. So when you bought a vehicle now, all that equity was attached to that certificate of ownership that was no longer in your possession. So then the state took them documents, the certificate of ownership, they're like a bearer bond, they're free and clear, and then took them to the bank and placed them on deposit, and they were used for, like I said, collateral to acquire bonds. So now that the banks were in possession of all these documents worth a lot of money, now they made a car loan available, because the bank was using their money to finance a car loan. They were using your neighbor's money who bought a car before you did, because the bank had an incentive to get as many cars on the road as fast as possible, because they're going to make money. The state wanted as many cars on the road as possible, because they're going to make more money. On a secondary note, this is why bus service, and well, back at the turn of the century back then, we had a well-established trolley system where you had trolley service, like from one city to the next. Also trains. They wanted the trolley system dismantled because they wanted people buying cars, or at least have the illusion of buying a car, because then the state's making money, the banks are making money. And then I got the third part of this series is going to be what happened in 1919 when the federal government took over. So from 1919 to the present, all vehicles became federal property from cradle to grave. So before I finish this video, the Act 202 of 1903, that was a hand, a poke, or a bluff, because it had no standing, no supportive legislation. The government did not sign a declared emergency. But in 1919, the federal government did act under a declared emergency. Now, what is interesting to point out, that this money arrangement, I gave it a name called the Detroit Ponzi scheme. The manufacturers had a vested interest to go along with the charade, and through their advertising campaigns they created the illusion of ownership. So even today, if you would go to a dealership, let's say you had enough money in your checking account, so you go to a dealership, you're going to buy a car, say $35,000. Now you pay cash, through check. So at that point you bought the car. It's your property, but in about 10 minutes, it's not going to be your property anymore, because you surrender the certificate of ownership. Now, in Pennsylvania, when you apply for a certificate of title, well, it says you shall apply. Well, the word shall is bastardized, because it means opposites. It's an oxymoron. Shall can be interpreted as mandatory or optional. Well, it says that you shall surrender the, well, they don't call it a certificate of origin. They distorted the name. They call it a manufacturer's statement of origin. But today, if you buy a new vehicle, you have to surrender the certificate of origin. But no one questions why. You go to a dealer and says, well, why don't I want to keep that document? If he says, oh, well, you have to, okay. Why? And if he points to that one section in the vehicle code, says, oh, see, it shall be accompanied. Well, the word, like I said, the word shall. Supreme Court ruled that the word shall, if it's found in a code or statute, it means an option. It does not mean mandatory. So it says, no, it's an option. I want to keep it. I said the manufacturers had a vested interest to fabricate the illusion of ownership, because they want to sell vehicles. But then no vehicle is ever sold. After the initial point of sale, the only thing that you could buy, sell, or trade that's tangible is a piece of paper. So after the initial point of sale, the only thing you own that's tangible is what they call a certificate of title. And then you could buy, sell, or trade that document, not the vehicle. This document is linked to the VIN plate. And as an example, if you bought a car and it was financed, and let's say you defaulted on your loan, the bank cannot place a lien on the vehicle because that's federal property. So what the bank does is it places a lien on the VIN plate. So if you default on your loan, the bank sends a tow truck to repossess the VIN plate that happens to be attached to a vehicle. Look at it that way. Later on, in another video, I got to explain how the language has been bastardized. See, the one thing that is evident on these, like the certificate of title, this is one from 1970. Even the vehicle code, they mix up past time, present time, and future time, and it's all jumbled up together. So when you read a document, like this document here is from 1970. So this document, this whole document is in past time because it happened like many years ago. But you have to, when you're reading something, and you have to take these words and what words were. For example, if you bought a car, if you applied for a certificate of title on January the 1st of 1970, and this document was issued on the 10th of January. So you got to take all these words and divide them into groups. What it fits into the past time, present time, and then future time. I'll explain that in another video. So to sum up here, the registration of vehicles is a legacy of theft. There's that saying that registration is confiscation by proxy, and that's so true. If you owned your vehicle today, there would be a brass nameplate on the bolted on the outside of the vehicle. You buy the vehicle, the dealer would issue you a document, and then you're good to go. Now, for example, if you would go down to a place where they sell like Bobcat skid loaders, a Bobcat skid steer has they have a nameplate bolted on the outside of the vehicle. Therefore, it's a marked vessel. If you would buy, say, a skid steer, then the dealer would issue you called a certificate of origin, and that's one function is the property transfer receipt. And because registration is done in-house at the dealer level for the equipment, and that's the way it should be today with a vehicle. Today, a vehicle, we should go back to a vehicle is actual private property once again. See what this is all about. This was the socialists that pushed for this. That's like Social Security. It's actually called Socialist Security. You know, we make this big stink about the Nazis. Well, the Nazis was the National Socialist Party of Germany. Well, in America, we had a National Socialist Party of America. And it was just as into dirty deeds as what Hitler was doing, except what was taking place in America was done covertly. They were confiscating private property, but they made sure that you retain the illusion of ownership. That'll be for another video. Well, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the below. Until the next video. One thing I forgot. See, in 1905, that certificate of registration, that cardboard placard, had like two functions because it was also the registration plate. And now, starting in 1905, the registration, that certificate of registration, was converted to a handheld document. The brass nameplate, the elements that were contained in that brass nameplate, even though the plate itself was concealed, some of the elements were taken off that brass nameplate and then put on the outside of the vehicles. We're familiar today with the vehicle's emblem. The vehicle will show like it's an Infiniti or a Subaru, BMW, and so on. So these emblems, this is one part of the brass nameplate that was left, that stayed on the outside of the vehicle, while the bulk of the brass nameplate was concealed. So I just wanted to mention that.